Welcome to the Real Money Pathway, where I share my journey from financial collapse to lasting wealth. I'm David Kim, and I'll guide you through practical strategies that transform my finances and can transform yours too. Let's build your pathway to financial freedom. The content of this podcast is provided for general information purposes only and do not constitute financial advice. Listeners should not act upon the content or information here without first seeking appropriate advice from a financial professional. Welcome to the very first episode of Real Money Pathway. I'm David Kim, author of The Real Money Guide, the missing manual for financial recovery. This podcast is for anyone who's faced financial hardship, anyone who's stumbled and fallen, and anyone who's looking to build a stronger financial future. Before we dive in, I wanted to be completely transparent with you. I'm not just another financial expert trying to tell you what to do high atop an ivory tower. I'm someone who's actually lived through both extremes, from corporate success with all of its trappings to complete financial collapse. And of course, then back again to stability and growth through what I've learned. Today, I want to share that story, the story that I've kept hidden for so many years. And it all begins in a bankruptcy attorney's office under harsh fluorescent lights that seem to highlight every mistake I'd made. I can feel that desk under my palms sitting there in front of the attorney, looking at that stack of papers that represented basically the final collapse of my financial life. Despite my MBA, my training as a certified financial planner, I'd managed to lose everything. My savings, my investments, my home, and nearly my entire family. That moment changed everything for me, and today I want to share not just what happened, but those profound lessons that emerged from that failure. Lessons that have helped me rebuild, and that might hopefully help you too, wherever you are on your financial journey. My journey didn't start in that bankruptcy attorney's office. It began with promise and potential. After serving in the Marine Corps from 92 to 99, I transitioned to what seemed like this perfect career at Raytheon. With my military experience and my bachelor's degree in computer science that I'd earned while serving, I was actually a pretty attractive candidate in the defense sector. I had interviewed and received offers from Raytheon, Boeing, General Dynamics, and it turned out Raytheon provided the best offer. So my starting salary in 1999 was $60,000. At that time, it felt just enormous, amazing compared to my military pay, which at that time was around 25 to 30,000 taxable. Add to that a signing bonus, stock options, and of course, great benefits. I thought I'd made it. I said, this is it. This is what I've worked for. Within my first year, I had received a promotion, pretty nice salary increase, up to 75,000. By late 2001, my base salary had grown to 90,000, and with bonuses, I was pretty consistently earning six figures. Success came pretty quickly, and of course, with that came lifestyle changes. We had been in a pretty small apartment, $1,200 per month, but that quickly changed to a new construction house in an upscale neighborhood just north of Tucson. I ended up trading in our Honda Passport, but we traded that in for a brand new Lexus ES300. It's a purchase I rationalized as saying, hey, this is projecting success in the corporate world, just like my coworkers. At that time, my children were then enrolled in all sorts of private activities, from ballet to tutoring to expensive daycare. Each of these upgrades seemed pretty reasonable, actually, in isolation, especially given that growing income. During this time, I pursued my MBA while working full-time again, just like I had pursued my bachelor's. I leveraged Raytheon's tuition reimbursement as well as what remained of my GI Bill that I had used during service. And during that MBA program, part of it had a certified financial planner coursework. So on paper, it was this great picture of success, rising through the ranks of a large defense company, prestigious company with impressive credentials, the MBA, the CFP. But here's that irony that still haunts me. It's Despite that financial education, I was making these huge fundamental mistakes with my own money. Each increase in income led to corresponding increases in spending, creating a cycle that seemed sustainable, of course, as long as my career trajectory continued upwards. So then came 2003. Success, it can be intoxicating, it can be blinding sometimes, especially when you're responsible for providing for your family. I felt pretty invulnerable. I said, what else can I do? So that's when I made that decision that eventually started leading to that financial collapse. I decided to join a venture to open a Japanese restaurant in a high growth area of Tucson. The numbers all looked promising on paper. My MBA had taught me about business plans, analysis, marketing, financial projections, all of that. It was roughly a $600,000 investment. So between the partners, we each came up with about 150,000 of capital to put towards building this Japanese restaurant from the ground up. I convinced myself, this is a great investment. It's something that'll provide great additional income, maybe even future employment. Of course, my wife at the time expressed some deep concerns. My parents expressed even deeper concerns about the risks. Having grown up in a family that had multiple restaurants, I still remember when I talked to my parents, my mother, she said, we'd lived through this and we've created restaurants and grown them. And she didn't want to see me go through that because of those difficulties she had gone through. Of course, my response was, well, with my education and my training and what I know about business, it'll be different. I can be better. I'll succeed. This will be different. I can still remember signing that lease, feeling both excitement, anxiety, but I was about to learn one of the most expensive lessons of my life. Fast forward to early 2004. The restaurant's failure had become impossible to ignore. The monthly losses mounted. My personal financial reserves were gone. They were completely depleted. And the timing couldn't have been worse. The restaurant was failing. Raytheon had announced a major restructuring after its acquisitions of multiple businesses. So, despite having been there for nearly 5 years, and with my expertise and what I had been doing, I found myself among those laid off. The double impact of a failing business, job loss, shattered that illusion of invulnerability and threatened basically everything I'd worked for, everything I'd worked to provide for my family. So within months, I went from a six-figure corporate leader to now someone who's struggling to pay even the most basic bills. Amazingly, a lifeline appeared. Within 2 months of job searching, I secured a position with a management consulting firm in Dallas, starting at nearly $100,000. On paper, it looked like a pretty impressive recovery. Quick bounce back that would solve our financial troubles. The move to Dallas in 2004 should have represented a fresh start and a chance to rebuild on a stronger foundation after that restaurant failure and layoff. With my daughter at 6 years old, my son at 4, we pretty much had every opportunity to establish sound financial habits that would serve our growing family. Instead, I mistook that career recovery for financial recovery and financial knowledge recovery, never addressing those underlying patterns that had contributed to our previous setbacks. The immediate relief of that consulting income created this dangerous illusion. I believed our previous financial problems were just insufficient income, bad luck, rather than flawed financial behavior. Each career advancement and increase in compensation at this consulting company reinforced this false narrative. I thought my MBA and CFP had provided me some financial sophistication that I had completely failed to implement basic principles like emergency savings and controlling my spending and having sustainable debt management, living within my means. Our Dallas transition actually cemented this destructive pattern of prioritizing the appearance of that success over actual financial reality. The house we had purchased was well beyond our reasonable limits, even for my substantial income. Rather than viewing that restaurant failure as a warning to a moderate lifestyle, we treated that new consulting position as basically permission to pursue even more and more of an expensive one. After years, there was a Mercedes in the driveway, ultimately one for each kid. And we had this lifestyle that projected this image of success, while masking this growing financial instability. By 2010, fast forward 6 years, my travel had increased, and most consequentially, winning a state contract, which was based in Austin, had me traveling to Austin very frequently. What started as hotel stays and weekend commutes evolved into basically a fundamental separation of our lives. By May 2011, I had maintained an apartment in Austin. My trips home decreased from weekly to bi-weekly, then monthly, and then by 2014, probably once every few months. This geographical separation definitely created more than just physical distance. It was emotional distance. It also established some financial fragmentation that accelerated that decline. Running two households basically may not have doubled our expenses, but it was pretty close. We lost that shared visibility, and that prompted some difficulties but necessary conversations about this situation. There was this discussion that I still remember in 2011, a year after I had been traveling. And it reinforced and revealed that disconnect that would ultimately prove pretty fatal to both our finances and our marriage. So I suggested that the family relocate to Austin following this major state contract award, and knowing that most of my work would be in Austin from now on. But my wife at the time refused and said that separation was okay, and that uprooting the children from schools and their social circles would do too much damage. So, we decided, okay, then we'll maintain these separate households with these higher living expenses, while now, knowing that it reduced that emotional connection, a devastating combination. The storm that revealed our financial vulnerability physically came on June 13th. I still remember that day because it was a tornado that basically ripped through parts of North Dallas. I still remember our family was huddled inside the closet under our staircase, hail pounding the roof. The morning revealed a partially destroyed roof and this deductible to repair it that we just couldn't afford. Despite earning this huge income, I didn't even have enough cash on hand to cover this, what should have been relatively modest expense at my income, to cover the deductible. So I found myself requesting an advance from my employer out of a future bonus so that I could pay for this. That moment served as a pretty powerful metaphor for our financial situation, the appearance of a structural soundness masking that vulnerability that was there. Just as the storm exposed that, this financial situation exposed the truth about what our finances were actually like. Despite my impressive title, growing consulting practice, and what looked like success, at least in business, it was this financial house of cards that just couldn't even withstand a minor unexpected expense. So by the end of 2013, the pattern of living between Austin and Dallas created a pretty huge strain on our finances and relationship. The distance from my family reflected that emotional and financial divide. And basically by 2014, it was mathematically impossible, right, for our situation, and it was unavoidable. Monthly obligations were way higher than my income. And so, even with substantial consulting income, the combined weight of the separate living expenses and accumulated debt that we could not get out of, it was just unsustainable. And the final catalyst came, of course, in September of 2014 after a major loss of a state contract. I was laid off again from my role as a managing director in consulting. This eliminated any kind of predictable income, of course. Credit card balances were already reaching its limits, which cascaded into sitting at my bankruptcy attorney's office, which is where our story began. So looking back, I see now that my recovery from the restaurant was not really a recovery at all. It was merely a temporary reprieve fueled by income growth without the fundamental changes in financial mindset and habits that the true recovery requires. I had changed jobs, but I didn't change behavior. I had increased income, but not wisdom. So the lessons of that restaurant failure, the need for emergency savings, sustainable spending, financial balance, they all remained unlearned until this bankruptcy forced me to face them. So we come back to that day that I talked about earlier, and the day that I can never forget, sitting at the bankruptcy attorney's office, those lights, those harsh lights that made the papers look so bright with debt. The chair was soft, but almost too comfortable for the reality I was facing. We looked through the documents, and again, over 200,000 in debt, personal loans, 4 Mercedes vehicles with plenty remaining on loans and lease payments, a mortgage with close to 400,000 remaining, and monthly obligations of close to 10,000 per month with literally no income. So all these numbers just blurred in front of me. How had I, someone with an MBA, financial planning education, how did I end up here? I remember struggling to breathe normally, to maintain composure as we discussed Chapter 7 filing and what assets I might be able to retain. The drive home was the longest of my life. I had rehearsed, what I would try to tell my family, how I would explain what changes we had to go through. The weight of that responsibility and the failure just pushed down on me like physical force. I'd spent years building an image of success and stability. Now I had to admit that it had been on quicksand. My carefully constructed financial life had crumbled, and I had nobody to blame but myself. What makes this moment so pivotal wasn't that financial implication. It was a realization that I had prioritized appearance over substance, immediate gratification over long term security. I had all the knowledge I needed, but I hadn't applied it to my own life. As I pulled into our driveway, a driveway we would soon have to leave, I made a promise. I said I would rebuild. I would never make these mistakes again. And someday, if I can, I would share them with anybody that would listen so I can help them avoid the paths and the lessons that I had learned. The immediate aftermath of bankruptcy creates this strange paradox. On one hand, there's that shame and stigma. But on the other hand, there's this unexpected sense of clarity and freedom. Once you've hit that bottom, you've got nothing left to lose. It wipes away everything, and now every step forward represents progress. My first ally in recovery was my good and best friend, Casey. When my divorce had left me searching for both direction and shelter, he opened his home to me with no hesitation, more than just offering a place to stay, but he became more than a friend, but a mentor to me whose support extended way beyond just practical. I remember sitting in the kitchen table, lost, not knowing where to begin. And his words were, you don't need to impress anybody. Focus on creating the value and managing what you have, the right opportunities. His approach to money was thoughtful, intentional, focused on value rather than status. It stood in pretty deep contrast with the environment that I had tried to create. and that had contributed to that collapse. Where my previous professional circles often encouraged consumption and status signaling, Casey demonstrated that financial security came through actually restraint and purposeful spending. After many conversations, I began rebuilding what was the most basic elements of financial security, an emergency fund. But with my life in shambles, my financial and personal life, even starting that seemed overwhelming. But I started. I started with just even the smallest $25 transfer into savings, which felt insignificant, but also something powerful. It was more of a commitment to a different approach. The next week, I saved another 25. Within 6 months, I had built up $500 into that emergency fund. The next challenges I had were establishing basic banking relationships, which I discovered was very difficult after a bankruptcy. Then came an unexpected breakthrough. Chase Bank, recognizing my former military service, approved me for a personal checking account with no fees and restrictions, even despite my bankruptcy. So that small bit of acceptance actually helps restore just a bit of dignity during this difficult, challenging time. These small steps, just within a emergency fund and a basic banking relationship, seem trivial compared to the financial heights I'd previously reached. But they represented something so much more, far more valuable. They were the foundation of that sustainable financial practices rather than that illusion of success. Financial collapse strips away everything. It forces you to confront not just financial mistakes, but the thinking patterns that created them. As I rebuilt from nothing, several profound lessons emerged, insights that have guided my approach to money ever since. First came actually through a journey entry I wrote about 6 months into my recovery. I had been reflecting on my pre bankruptcy lifestyle, the specific Mercedes models that were in our driveway, the country club membership that we couldn't afford. I wrote, "Success without wisdom creates vulnerability." All my technical and financial skills and career advancement didn't translate to a drop of financial wisdom. This insight hit me like physical force. I had been so focused on looking successful that I had undermined actual security. The appearance-based spending was motivated more by image than actual need. Perhaps most painfully, I had to confront how my financial decisions had affected my family. I still remember the conversations with my children when I had to explain why we were moving back into an apartment. Their questions weren't about status or appearance, they were about security and even the activities they had loved that we couldn't afford. That conversation taught me another crucial lesson. Financial decisions affect everyone who depends on you. My pursuit of status had created vulnerability for people who never asked for it. The memory of explaining to my children that we had to leave their friends and their school behind because of my financial mistakes remains still one of the most painful of my life. Another revelation came through understanding how isolation contributed to my collapse. I had kept our financial struggles private, presenting a facade of success, even as our situation deteriorated. This isolation prevented me from receiving advice or support that actually might have changed that trajectory. Financial shame is a powerful force that keeps us from seeking help when we actually need it the most. Breaking through that shame, being willing to admit mistakes, and asking for guidance became essential to my recovery. The relationships I built, particularly with Casey and later on with Lacey, provided not just emotional support, but practical wisdom I desperately needed. Perhaps the most powerful lesson actually came in understanding the difference between income and wealth. Before bankruptcy, I focused on earning more without managing what I earned. After bankruptcy, I learned that a modest income actually managed wisely creates more security than a substantial income managed poorly. This shifted my entire approach to money. Rather than viewing financial success as achieving a certain income level, I began seeing it as creating a sustainable system that allowed for both current needs and future security. So, this transformation in my thinking is perhaps best illustrated by how differently I handle increased income now. So, before bankruptcy, each raise or bonus immediately translated into an increase in lifestyle. Now, any kind of income increase accelerates wealth building. And while our lifestyle expands to a degree, it's much more modestly than before. The psychological freedom that this creates is perhaps the greatest benefit of my financial collapse and recovery. By breaking that cycle of lifestyle inflation and status seeking, I've discovered that moderate consumption combined with substantial savings creates so much more satisfaction than maximum consumption with minimal saving. Today's episode isn't just about sharing my story. It's about helping you take the first step in your own financial journey wherever you might be starting from. The most powerful tool I created during my early recovery is what I now call the Real Money Reality Check, and I've turned it into an interactive tool that you can access on my website. This comprehensive tool became the foundation for rebuilding my financial life. I've created an easy-to-use version of this on both of my companion websites, one for this podcast, realmoneypathway.com, and for my book, therealmoneyguide.com. So here's what it makes it so effective. First, it helps you track all your income streams, whether they're regular paychecks, variable consulting income, or passive income sources. The system automatically calculates monthly equivalents so you can truly understand your cash flow patterns regardless of when the money arrives. Second, it breaks down your expenses into clear categories: housing, utilities, transportation, daily living, health, debt payments, and other expenses. This categorization helps reveal spending patterns you might never have noticed before. Third, calculates your savings capacity and helps you allocate it across different priorities using an intuitive slider system. You can adjust the percentages for emergency funds, retirement, short-term goals, medium-term goals, long-term, and even some fun money. Fourth, it includes a cash flow scheduling function that maps your income and expenses throughout the month, showing you visually when cash crunches might occur and helping you plan accordingly. And finally, it helps you personalize your financial health, showing your savings rate, your debt to income ratio, housing expense percentage, and emergency fund status, all with color-coded alerts, so it'll help you identify areas that need your attention. This tool is made available to you free on both the podcast and book websites. What made this Real Money Reality Check transformative for me wasn't just about the numbers that it generates, but the clarity it provides. It moved me from vague anxiety about money to concrete understanding of exactly where I stood and what needed to change. I encourage you to access this interactive tool. Set aside some time to complete it honestly. The clarity it provides, while sometimes uncomfortable, creates the foundation for meaningful financial transformation. Today, we've explored the beginning of my financial journey, the collapse that forced me to rebuild from scratch, but knowing what happened is just the first step. Understanding the psychological pattern that created those circumstances and the emotional impact of financial trauma is equally important. In our next episode, we're going to dive deep into the psychology of financial recovery. We'll explore how financial collapse creates lasting emotional impacts, from the shame that prevents us from seeking help to that grief process we experience with significant financial loss. I'll share how my own bankruptcy created ongoing anxiety about financial decisions and how that dining room table moment with bankruptcy paperwork created lasting psychological impacts. We'll also discuss how financial recovery isn't just about numbers, it's about rebuilding confidence through small wins. And most importantly, we'll tackle how financial stress impacts relationships. I'll share the painful lessons from my divorce experience and Contrast that with the third date financial conversation with Lacey that created the foundation for a much healthier financial partnership. I hope you'll join us for this deeply personal exploration of the emotional side of money. It's the side that is rarely talked about. And in the meantime, I invite you to reflect on your own emotional responses to financial situations. Thank you for joining me for this inaugural episode of The Real Money Pathway. Financial collapse isn't the end. It can be the beginning of something stronger. No matter where you're starting from, that path forward begins with an honest assessment and a commitment to consistent improvement. So until next time, I'm David Kim. Remember, it's not just about money, it's about building your real money pathway to freedom. Thanks for joining me on the Real Money Pathway podcast. I'm David Kim, reminding you that financial success isn't about perfection, it's about progress. So subscribe now for more strategies, and remember, your journey to lasting wealth starts with the very next decision you make.